Without any further ado, I will get into the content of my presentation today. And yes, indeed, I do want to convince you that you should care about rural crime, and I also want to outline to you a few of the reasons why, and also importantly, what we can do about it as individuals, as a society as well. So let's start with untangling a little bit about what rural is. And perhaps a little bit of history to start. So from the late 1700s and throughout the 1800s, we had that great exodus, that great migration from the agrarian countryside into the new big burgeoning cities, demanding as they did enormous amounts of labour to work in the factories. And so over a period of time, you saw a transition between the city being the place of hope and the potential for wealth becoming less desirable. This was a time, of course, where you didn't have a social welfare safety net. Think in literary terms about Fagin's gangs stealing to survive, and crime thriving as well. And so we've developed over a period of time, and it still remains to this day, this notion of the rural as being idyllic, as tranquil, as a place to escape. Many of you, and so this notion of the village countryside, the sort of the village life, very much a place of romance, and again that notion of the idyllic. And I know that many of you, probably even just halfway through February, have perhaps spent a few moments on a travel website, gone to booking.com and thinking about whether you might get a couple of days away on a weekend to the Lake District or a week in Provence, and that's the places that we want to go to: coastal places, to lakesides, to rivers, get away from the hustle and the bustle of the city. And some people aren't doing that just for weekends, of course, but are making that a permanent change. So this notion of the sea changes and the tree changes, people making that escape to the country. This, of course, alters the social fabric of rural communities when you've got a migration back into those rural settings, and that disjuncture that happens between people who, well, we've been like this for generations, and you've got these newcomers coming along. Fly in, fly out mining operations is a good case in point, where you've got this massive population growth into what has hitherto perhaps been a very small, close-knit community. The COVID-19 pandemic, of course, has heightened this too, where people are able to travel to the country, stay there, commute back and forward if they need to, but working from home. So we're seeing a real change in what we have hitherto known as being rural spaces. Right on the flip side, though, right at the other end of the spectrum, there's that notion of the rural horror, that dark side of the rural, sort of the great unknown again here, and a polar extreme to that notion of rural spaces as being idyllic, the rural being seen as empty and harsh, that unknown quantity. And this is portrayed both in real life circumstances, but also in fictional portrayals too. And perhaps just one example is the Snowtown murders, which you may or may not be familiar with, happened during the 1990s in South Australia. 3 people with an accomplice killed 12 others and dumped their bodies in barrels in the old vault in a former bank in a very small country town in South Australia. And lots of other visual representations of that rural horror. We can think as well around people, not just places. And I got my family to help me with this just a couple of days ago on the weekend as I was putting the slides together. What are the first images that we think of when we think of rural people? And this is what we came up with. You might have some stereotypical images of rural people too. And perhaps these stereotypes are brought about by a degree of ignorance, most certainly through popular culture, and they shape and they skew our attitudes and therefore our responses to crime which happens outside of cities. If I move on. But they're all stereotypes, and there is a degree of scholarship. I can highly recommend a book by Karen Hayden, published just last year, called The Rural Primitive in American Popular Culture. And in this book, she really challenges some of those myths of the rural idyll. She disabuses those stereotypes of the rural which have developed and continue to persist. She observes in this book a bias in popular culture and discusses and teases apart some of those mythologies which have developed as well. So well worth a read. Right, a big first reason to care. There's a lot of rural people. In fact, in 2017, 3.4 billion people in the world live in rural settings, 4.1 in urban. It was only, and you might be surprised by this, it certainly takes many by surprise, that it was only in 2007. That's only, if I do my maths correctly, 15 years ago, where the urban global population exceeded the rural. So it's relatively recent that that has occurred. It was only in the 1990s in the state of Queensland here in Australia that the urban population centred around Brisbane and the Gold Coast, and that southeastern part of Queensland exceeded the rest of the state's population. A state which had developed along sugar cane and mining all up and down the coast. And Brisbane was just a small provincial city up until relatively recently. So this is all very interesting, but how do we actually determine rurality? Well, there's a number of different different measurements as well. Mostly, of course, they're focused on population density. So how many people are living in an area? Some of the Australian measurements will also attend to issues around service centres and the distance by road to those centres. How accessible are places? You think about some of the very remote. We talk about rural, regional, and remote, and then you've got your ultra remote places in the Kimberley, up in the far north of Australia, in other parts of the world too, parts of the far north of Canada, places that are only accessible by plane or boat, and certainly not by road. And in England as well, the rural urban classification used based on, again, a resident population. But let's compare a few different, or let's have a look at a few different examples. And here I've got 4 images on the screen here. A fly-in, fly-out mining operation up in the north of Western Australia, where workers at the mines will come in for a week or 2 weeks, live there during that time, and then go back to Perth or somewhere else where they might have to live. In fact, during the big mining boom a few years ago, people were flying from, commuting from places like Sydney and Melbourne all the way up into the Kimberley and the Pilbara and other places like that. So instantaneously, a lot of wealth. They're highly paid for living and working in remote communities. Again, spa country. So this is a picture of a place called Hepburn Springs, which is about an hour and a half drive from Melbourne. And I think you have to win the lottery if you're going to actually buy a place there now, because such is the affluence of the place, its proximity to Melbourne. You know, you've got 4-lane freeways that join it, whereas they didn't exist in the past. Broadacre farms, big wheat farms out in the western districts of Victoria, vineyards on the Mornington Peninsula where I live. I think the reason I posed these or put these photos to you is to illustrate the enormous diversity and difference which exist, and to underscore a key point that the rural is not homogenous. So we can't think of the rural as one homogenous place. Here's the urban and here's the rural. They are all quite different places with different geographies and different demographies too. We can also think about some of those very isolated and yet confined. So if we're going to accept the notion that rural is low population densities or vastly spread populations, think of a place like Antarctica, where by virtue of the circumstances there, it's bitterly cold. People have to live on the stations in very close confines. These extreme and unusual environments, isolated and confined environments, which can actually lead to some of the transgressions which occur when you're putting a whole heap of people together in close confines, and yet at the same time, extremely remote. Rob White and Rebecca Kaiser have been doing a bit of work on this as well, thinking around about the space station too. So very isolated place, but putting a whole heap of people together in close proximity and wondering if everybody's going to get along. A bit like the Big Brother house perhaps as well. So it's a little bit complicated, isn't it? Very difficult to define rural, no consistent definition of rural either. And perhaps, as some scholars have suggested, it's a little bit more amorphous, those different amorphous traits. It might be more of a way of life. And I particularly like this, this quote at the top of this slide, interviewed by Ralph Weishaupt and colleagues. This particular sheriff said, "Rural is like pornography. I can't precisely define it, but I know it when I see it." They're very, very difficult to define. So we get to another reason why we should care about rural crime, and we can think about this perhaps on a very individualized level. Thinking about the hip pocket nerve. And go to the supermarket, and if grocery prices are skyrocketing, you're going to feel that, and you're going to take an active interest. But what you might not necessarily think about is why it is that those property prices have increased. Very few people are going to see a price rise and think that perhaps there's been significant criminal activity that has impacted a farmer's ability to produce, has disrupted the production process. So that's a very good reason to care, but also to food security. Which is and the impacts as well on the both local economies and the national economy too. The value of production in Australia for 2021-22 is estimated to be worth $78 billion, of which we export a fair bit of that. So if there are disruptions through crime and offending, biosecurity issues as well, when people are trespassing upon land, those significant impacts will be felt by the individual consumer. But there's a whole heap of impacts as well on farmers, their families, and farm communities, whether they're financial or social. The loss of bloodlines. A lot of farmers will invest heavily for 15, 20, 25 years into a particular line of animal. That becomes their speciality. That's their brand. That's their trade. And if key breeding ram, for instance, are stolen, that will really disrupt that farmer's ability to produce. Another thing, and I see Cressida's here with us today. Cressida Smith from Harper Adams University. She's been doing a lot of work recently on the impacts of farm crime on mental health, the mental health impacts on farmers. And I've put up one article here for you to go and have a look at in your own time, but I think there's more on the way. It's really fascinating, the impacts of crime on farmers. Not fascinating because it's a happy and enjoyable topic. It's farmers are some of the least likely to go and seek any assistance, and the impacts in rural community can be enormous when farmers quite literally take matters into their own hands. Some of the other big impacts as well: disruption to production, productive farmers leaving the sector, leaving gaps, the children of farmers not wanting to take on the family business, finding opportunities elsewhere, and there's also this enormously high likelihood of repeat victimisation of farmers too. So it's not all beer and skittles going out there in the bush, I can assure you. And just for the fun of it, just because I took this photo last year and I like it a lot, is we can just think, should we care if the cows actually take over? What happens if they do get guns? We should be very, very worried. Okay, another key point to recognise and acknowledge is that rural crime is very globalised, and it doesn't know political borders. So we can draw lines on a map. Individual criminals and criminal networks and gangs are not going to respect those particular borders. And I can perhaps highlight one key example, and that is of teak logging, which happens in Myanmar. Highly illegal, and yet the border between Myanmar and India is rather porous, and those illegally logged timber is transferred across the border, as to our people and gold and other items of value both ways. The teak itself then gets made into, either gets sold as it is or gets made into furniture and gets sold through China, other parts of Asia as well. Absolutely devastating to those a very valuable and finite resource. Some of the other issues that we can consider as well around climate change knows no borders. the impacts of decisions by political decision makers, such as the president of Brazil when it comes to the Amazon, the impacts that it has locally on subsistence farmers, but also more broadly, when we think about the Amazon as being the lungs of the world, it has an impact on all of us wherever we are. We ought to care. We ought to care what is happening. One of the significant issues, of course, though, is that a lot of crime which occurs in rural settings is a little bit out of sight and out of mind. It's hidden crime, if you like. Not a lot of empirical, scholarly research on things such as rural elder abuse, a significant and key gap which needs to be attended to. And again, sorry, not to pick on you, Cressida, but a lot of work that yourself and Richard Byrne have been doing on issues around modern slavery. Some of the work that Susie Thomas and Louise Nicholas have been doing on heritage crime. The pilfering of roofs from small village churches where some of the older parishioners will turn up on Sunday to get the place open and ready for the vicar to perform the service, and they find that there's water dripping in because the entire roof's been carted off in the middle of the night some few days before. So a lot of those there's less capable guardianship that's present. If we're to adopt some of those crime prevention terms, less capable guardianship that's occurring in those rural communities, both in the human form, but also in the electronic form in terms of things like CCTV cameras and other technologies. And here we have the dark figure of crime. So this is the notion that crime is occurring, but it is not necessarily being reported. So we might compare crime rates in major urban settlements with in rural communities and say, oh, there's hardly any crime going on out there. Surely it would appear in the statistics. That's not necessarily because the crime is not occurring. It's not necessarily being reported, and for a whole variety of reasons. And perhaps on that, I can just turn our attention now to some of the work that I've been doing over the last number of years on farm crime and agricultural crime. And something that we ought to care about for some of the reasons I've already outlined, but for a few more that I'll outline now. This is the New South Wales Rural Crime Prevention Team's definition of rural crime: incidents of crime that impact on the function of the pastoral, agricultural, and aquaculture industries. And you might ears might prick up when you hear around aquaculture as a farming. Down in Tasmania, there's this enormous amount of salmon farming that occurs. That in itself causes an enormous amount of environmental issues. But there's also the theft, not only from those farms, but also from oyster hatcheries of the little spawn. You have to, and anybody who's I don't know what the going price for a dozen oysters is in the UK at the moment, but it was about $16 or $18 Australian. So was that maybe £8 or £10? So it is highly lucrative. But one of the key things about agricultural crime is there has to be more often than not, there has to be a degree of awareness of the industry. So let's localise and contextualise, and I'll just spend just a couple of minutes just talking to you and discussing a couple of surveys that I've done over the last few years. One of them was of farmers in Victoria. The other was in a couple of rural urban residential burglary sites. So we were testing the efficacy and trialling the use of selected DNA, a liquid property marking technology in some of those for residential burglary, but using the same bank of questions that we'd used with farmers just a year previously. So thinking about perceptions of crime, reporting of crime, attitudes to policing, and so on and so forth. So just a couple of slides here where a little bit of comparison between the rural and the urban. So for the question, have you or someone on your property ever been a victim of crime or offence? Farmers were more victimised than reported that they had been victimised more often than those people in those quarter-acre block type living arrangements. Has somebody been a victim, an individual themselves responded to a survey being a victim of theft from their property? Farmers were also more likely to be victims of theft. And here again, we can think about some of those you know, basic crime prevention teachings and learnings around capable guardianship. Properties are far further apart. There are less people around, so there's less eyes, less ears. And so the possibility for victimisation will be increased, will be enhanced. So a number of reasons why farms are targeted, and I've broken them up into 3 categories, and you can see on this slide the socio-demographic factors. So the more sort of laissez-faire attitude, she'll be apples, she'll be right, that relaxed attitude to security. I had one farmer just anecdotally said, I never lock up my sheds. My dad never locks up his sheds. My granddad never locked up his sheds. We've never done it, and we probably never will. And the chances of being victimised are much more enhanced if you don't lock up yourself. So that's sort of that laissez-faire, laconic attitude. But one particular thing that I will highlight for you is the very last box on the bottom of the 3rd column, and that's tractors and machinery, which are key to life. And when I first started pursuing an active interest in farm crime and agricultural crime, I was absolutely blown away that, and you may or may not be aware of this yourself, but every John Deere tractor is key to life. One key that starts one John Deere tractor will start another. Same with other manufacturers too. And there's this great story that was passed on to me by a police officer in Western Victoria. It's about a person who had bought a little hobby farm and had gone out to the property, and with the property came an old John Deere tractor. The previous owner didn't need it, left it there, but he couldn't find a key for it. So he searched all over it. He found the serial number. He's found other engine numbers and whatnot. He's dutifully jotted them all down and goes along at the next opportunity to the tractor dealership in the town and says to the bloke behind the counter, here's all the details. I need a key for this. The guy behind the counter points to a shoebox at the end and says, help yourself to a key. They're all the same. So some of those things that we take for granted when we get into our late model cars and they're beeping, and mine's, it's like a cacophony of sounds when I get into my my relatively modern car now, and the ability to steal it is a lot less than a John Deere tractor. Okay, so farms are vulnerable. So what's getting stolen from farms? Equipment and tools, farm supplies and inputs, and livestock are the 3 biggest things that are targeted. And again, there has to be that sort of that acquired agricultural knowledge. If I'm not from a farming background myself, I would be hard pressed to go and steal a sheep. First and foremost, where would I dispose of it? That's the next big challenge that I'd have. But people in the know, people who are involved in the sector, will have that ability, and the ease at which they can steal stuff. Just to give you one quick example, I visited a farm just a couple of years ago, and the farmer had 200 sheep in a mob. And he said, I'll send my dog in, I'll peel off 20. You count them as I peel them off, and just imagine that there's a horse float or a tandem trailer just over there. He sends the dog in. Within 60 seconds, he's peeled off 20 in a straight line. The dog's got them in a straight line. Just imagine they were just going up the ramp of the trailer, and they'll be away in a minute. Such is the ability of some thieves that they can direct their dogs by hand signals in moonlight on a full moon. Don't even make a sound. So those are some of the issues. Thefts can be both opportunistic, for some of those, just see something lying around a tool, or targeted. And there are reports of organised criminal gangs who will target $500,000 wheat headers. If they've got a market for it somewhere else, they might steal something from the Western District of Victoria and have it 3,000 kilometres away 3 days later, up in the far north of Queensland, perhaps, if they know that they've got a purchaser. So, and pretty much anything that's not bolted down will be targeted if there's a monetary value, and that includes firearms. And here's another reason that we ought to care about rural crime, and it's because there is now increasingly a crossover between crime that happens in rural spaces and crime that happens in urban environments. And firearms is a case in point. Shotguns and rifles are a tool of the trade on farms. Here in Australia, at least, take care of vermin, euthanize animals, and so on and so forth. But since some fairly significant gun law reform back in 1996 after a massacre in Hobart at Port Arthur, and gun laws were massively tightened up and there was an enormous amnesty, it's much harder to acquire a gun. So where do criminal networks know that they can find a ready supply? On farms, of course. And there have been incidences where it's not just through the slackness of a farmer leaving a gun lying around, but entire gun cabinets, 150 kilogram gun cabinets will be unbolted from the floor and carted off. And what happens to these? They tend to get sawn down and then sold to any wannabe meth dealer who needs to be, armed and equipped and carrying, and then they're used in criminal conduct in urban settlements. 1,300 guns are reported stolen each year in Australia, with fewer than a quarter ever recovered. So you've got that sort of that grey market of firearms around. Another reason why we should care about what happens beyond the city. This had a direct linkage around some of those issues around farmers' mental health again, and that's the sort of the perceptions of worry and the fear of crime. And for those of you who are criminologists listening today, you'll know that it's a fairly powerful and significant factor, that worry and that fear of crime occurring against you, and that sort of that almost that secondary victimization which occurs if you feel that you're going to be targeted. Again, we should care on an interpersonal level about what happens to people elsewhere. Having things stolen from outside the farmhouse, so from sheds and paddocks, is something that almost 70%, 69.9% of farmers were either fairly or very worried about. Here again, that lack of capable guardianship. Worried because you can't be everywhere all over the farm, particularly really large properties. Here, and again, a direct relationship with some of those issues around that dark figure of crime, is the reluctance of farmers to report crime. A few reasons advance as to why a farmer might not wish to report the crime, or might see no value in reporting the crime. A belief that there is not enough evidence for the police to proceed, difficult to tell if a crime has occurred, or a belief that police would do nothing about it. If a farmer is excuse me, just have a sip of water. A farmer might only muster their sheep perhaps 5 times a year for drenching, for shearing, for counting. And so there might be 3 months transpiring between counts. If the theft of say 10, 20, 50 sheep has occurred in that meantime, any evidence of dust, footprints, any other evidence is well and truly gone. What are they going to say to the police? The assets have been well and truly disposed of, perhaps in the next door neighbour's freezer by the time that the loss of the sheep is actually observed. Some of those interpersonal issues as well: fear of revenge, retaliation, small close-knit communities. I know who did it is a common refrain, but I have to live next to this bloke. His son's the captain of the local footy club. I have to deal with these people. I don't want to cause any drama. I'll just let it slide. Some of those reasons. Okay, so the old adage, prevention is better than cure. And in terms of crime prevention, I can highly recommend this book. Very well edited, I must say. If I put in a shameless plug for this particular one, came out last year in the Routledge series. But a few different things. So if I can summarize an entire 120,000 words into one single slide, a number of different formal measures which can be implemented to prevent crime from happening in real spaces. And those are things like installation of CCTV, the presence of guard dogs, locking stuff up, those sorts of things. And again, I'm thinking first and foremost around farm crime and agriculture crime. Some of the informal mechanisms, just word of mouth, people saying, "Oh, just watch out, John's got the habit of just helping himself to a few things and not returning them," is a polite way of putting it. Some of the cultural issues around snubbing, so not talking to somebody, not waving to them as you're passing by. There's a fascinating thing in the chapter in this book around heritage crime, and it relates to the spreading of rumours of cursed objects. This is in the petrified forest in Arizona, where people used to steal some of the petrified wood. So instead of just saying, please do not steal the stuff, they put up saying, please note that these objects are cursed, and all woe will befall you if you steal this stuff. And they've now collected this enormous pile of letters where people have come back in the dark of night and dropped the stuff off with a letter saying, I stole this, and then this happened, and this happened, and this happened. It's too much. I just what I wanted. There's a big pile of this stuff as well as the letters that are left. Up in Opal Ridge, I had an honours student just recently do some work on what's called ratting. This is people who will scurry down somebody else's opal mine and steal all the opal. So they haven't had to go to the trouble and expense of digging the mine, putting in all the infrastructure, but they scurry down and steal the thing. It's called ratting. So rumours have abounded for multiple generations that ratters get their hands chopped off. So take it on us. There's a whole heap of stories that go back about this. Use of technology as well is important, such as high-tech property marking and different law enforcement strategies too. So perhaps in terms of policing, a return to a more community policing style in rural communities, making sure that rural police officers have a degree of agricultural awareness, so that when they turn up to a farm and the farmer says, my Dorper ram's been stolen, they say, what year is that pickup truck? What year is that ute? Not realising it's a beast we're on four legs. As soon as this occurs, there's going to be that barrier put in place between the farmer and the police officer, and the perceptions are obviously going to be challenged. So another big issue, before I go into some of the things that we can do ourselves, and that is around access to justice or accessing justice. And here we can think about the formal aspects and elements of the criminal justice system, police stations and the courts. A couple of examples. A lot of police stations, in my state of Victoria, the reason, the distance between police stations up until recently, before there was a closure of many of them, was based on how far a horse and cart could go in one day. So they might have been 100 kilometres apart. Of course, with modern travel, you don't need them quite so close. So there's been a consolidation of police stations, but that's difficult. All the hours have changed, or police officers will come in rather than live next to the station. They might come in from another place, another larger settlement. And so there's some access issues. In terms of the courts as well, we can think about not only the physical location of the courts, but also their accessibility. So a lot of them were built in the post-war era, and the 1950s and the 1960s, when issues around disability were not front of mind. And so they'll have steps going up to them. That is immediately limiting access for many people. Some of the other issues around for survivors of family or domestic violence. There's a fantastic report, it's a little bit old now, it's go back to about 2014, written by Amanda George and Bridget Harris. And it was this fantastic analysis and interviews with a whole heap of survivors here in rural Victoria. And some of the issues, just one that I'll highlight. When the court case is called, the supermarket over the road, everybody in the supermarket over the road putting their veggies in their shopping trolley or picking up a can of baked beans can hear every announcement that's made at the courthouse. So Mrs. Jones, please come to court too. The entire town suddenly knows that she's there. So that in itself are some issues if we're thinking about access and justice on a couple of different levels. Support services as well, and these can be accentuated in times of crisis, and particularly during floods and bushfires, where literally and figuratively you cannot access any support services because they're literally inaccessible. Another big issue that I think we ought to pay close attention to. Rightio, so now there's we turn our attention to some of the things that we might be able to do about them. We should take a care. So what next then? Well, there's a need for some institutional action, and whether this is around police resourcing, the implementation of dedicated teams of police. In New South Wales, where my university is located, there is a dedicated team, the New South Wales Rural Crime Prevention Team. I know that there are a number of teams. The Humberside Rural Crime Prevention Team, I see on Twitter yesterday, celebrated their 1-year anniversary, and up in North Wales and North Yorkshire and other places throughout the UK, there are dedicated rural policing teams. Recognising that the dark figure of crime exists, increasing awareness, education, prevention, resilience, in engaging and creating active citizens, really important things that we can encourage in terms of institutional action. Listening to people too, taking an active interest. But there's also a need for more scholarship too. And because there are an enormous number of theoretical and empirical gaps around definitions, around issues around rural policing, issues in Indigenous communities, fear and perceptions of crime, issues around violence, and I indicated things like child abuse and elder abuse, as well as violence against women in rural spaces, trafficking and access to justice as well. There's a new book series by Bristol University Press, which myself and Matt Bowden are editors of, and forthcoming in that is a chapter from Joe Donemeyer, who's with us today, and really pulling apart and teasing apart those different theoretical and empirical gaps in rural criminology. So something to look out for. And here is the aforementioned Bristol University Press series. There's also the Routledge Studies in Rural Criminology series, which Joe edits. And here's just a sample of books. I think the oldest one on this list goes back to 2016. There's been and that's Varney's one in the top left-hand corner, Rural Crime and Community Safety. There's a groundswell of interest and activity, and I think it's probably something that if I can leave you with one particular call for action, it is to get involved yourselves as well. Put a toe in the water, put the pads on and bat up and take a hit, whether you're wanting to you wanted to hit a couple of cheeky singles, or you're in there to knock out a couple of sixes over the pavilion, and whichever way you want to look at it, there's an opportunity for you. And a couple of things that you might do initially, if you are interested in whatever your discipline, whatever your preferred methodological approach, whether it's quant, qual, mixed methods, whatever it happens to be, whichever discipline you come from, there's an opportunity for you to think about things geographically and to take an interest in rural criminology. Getting a hold of Joe's International Handbook is a really good first port of call. Joining the Rural Criminology listserv as well, Joe's emails there on the screen for you. And just becoming a part of the community, which is larger and growing. There's an International Society of Rural Crime. There's the American Society's Division of Rural Criminology. Cressida and Arta Pitchlarts from Dublin coordinate the European Society's Rural Crime Working Group. And of course at UNE we have the Centre for Rural Criminology. And so because time is on the wing and we want to have some discussion and you want to maybe you want to get back to work. One last slide. And it's remiss of me not to put our good old friend Sir Robert Peel up, and two of the precepts that he coined so many years ago. The first being around the prevention of crime, a principal object to be obtained, and the second that of the police working and being their duty being dependent upon the public approval of police action. And to this, I can add both should apply regardless of geography. So hopefully I've managed to, in a short period of time, convince you that you should care about rural crime and given you a couple of pointers as to how you might do that. So enough of me. Here's my details, and I'm happy to stop sharing now and see if there's any questions or queries, or if there's any discussion that you might like to make.
Thank you so much, Alistair. And particularly, can I just say that outside of the fascinating talk, the cricket references at the end were fantastic about hitting sixes and like that. Yeah. So that was fantastic. So quickly now over to Karen Bullock from our department here, who's going to give a short response, and then I think we'll still have about 10 minutes for questions.
I'm hoping it's going to work. Given what we had earlier,
it is working.
I knew you'd like the cricket ones. Alistair, Thanks so much. I know it's the middle of the night, and I'm with you. At times we don't always completely get whether it's the morning or evening. Sometimes these things blur a little, but thank you for what's now probably 1 o'clock in the morning for you. So thanks so much for coming along and talking about these issues. Thanks also to Ranjana, of course, for supporting this programme, and Andy, who couldn't come today, unfortunately, and Rob, and the department for the continuation of the support for the visiting international fellowships that we've been doing, you know, for years and years on end. We've had to change them slightly, haven't we? But I think we've done a not too bad job. And Alistair, I thought you might have mentioned it, but you haven't. So I'll just briefly say what we've been doing is the money that Alistair was awarded for his fellowship was to do some work to help us to coordinate research looking at the police use of social media in at rural areas, which is probably something that lots of us have got some interest in as well, and we've made quite a lot of progress, I think. And for those of you who might remember her, we've recruited one of our former MSc students, Hilary Christmas, who's been doing some of the coding on and aspects of that work for us. So I think it's just been really great that even in these sort of difficult times where, you know, lots of things have been really disrupted, needless to say, we've been able to do some interesting and really fun stuff, which we can report on going forward. And I was supposed to say just a couple of things. I mean, lots of what you say, Alistair, needed to say is very similar to the sorts of work that I found. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a professor of criminology at the University of Surrey, and mostly I work in the field of policing and crime prevention to some extent as well, and have done, but more recently, some work on rural criminology and rural policing, and started to do some interviews, particularly with police officers actually, and some of their perceptions of some of this stuff. And, you know, obviously I've been sort of reading around this too, and lots of the themes, Alistair, that of course you draw attention to are very similar, if slightly different because of the context, but really, really sort of similar ones. And I'll just draw attention to a couple of things, and I'll try and be quick. The myths, you know, of the idyll, right? This sort of this rural kind of perfect place, and how that links back, I think, to some of the sort of associations that possibly come from. I'm not really a sociologist, but I think maybe they do come from sort of urban sociology and how we sort of situate crime within some of that. So some of those things sort of really, really come out, and of course, it's not true. And, you know, we sort of have these sort of ideas of these places which are crime free, and it's not right. And either way, as a consequence, there has not been, and your last slide was really good on this, you know, to show in the books and where they've suddenly come from. And recently, that actually, you know, it's taken time, hasn't it, for criminologists to sort of see that there's differences here. It's changing, absolutely, but it's taken a little bit of time to get sort of people to thinking about, well, look, what do crime problems look like differently in sort of urban versus rural areas, and what should we be doing to think about tackling them differently. And some of it's really interesting, and just to go on, and I honestly will be quick, what do we mean by rural? That's not always very, very clear. And what's a rural crime? And that can be tricky too, of course. I think all of the points that you make about why this is important and why it's missed are the same here. And there's others that are important too, which you touched on, sort of fear and trust and the impact, your tract story. I heard really similar things, you know, about it, that actually I think sometimes what we forget, well, I had no idea how much a tractor might cost. And when they go missing, how much money, the impact on somebody's livelihood, it's immense. I think your points, which you spoke about, Cressida's research as well, about the mental health issues, really, really so important. And some of these impacts have been really, really, really missed. Some of this in the UK context does come back to some of how from my research, the police make decisions about what crimes to prioritise, and this sort of threat, harm, risk sort of assessments that are sometimes used, and it sometimes misses some of this. So, you know, if it's a property crime, is perhaps not as taken as seriously. I don't mean that disrespectfully, as one that is against a human being, a violent one. And then if it's against an animal, say, you know, and you can see how that can occur. In terms of crime prevention, we've missed so many tricks, I think, Alistair, as you say yourself, in this regard. Different opportunity structures here, aren't there? And I think that's not always been considered because people sort of haven't made those connections. And the underreporting is a problem, it seems. So I ought to stop because I'm sure that people have got many more questions, but there's just many gaps. There's lots of gaps about how we think through prevention, how we really understand these crime problems. What do we do? How do we utilise technology properly? How do officers and teams of officers understand this? How are they best deployed, and so on and so forth? And then, and likewise, some of the work that I've been doing recently on this speaks specifically to this issue about investigations. So how do we deal specifically with investigations which might pick up some of these rural issues, which can be a little bit challenging for various reasons. And I would honestly stop. Thank you.
I highlighted a whole.
Does anybody have any questions? Or Alistair, did you want to respond to this?
I was just going to say, I've highlighted quite a number of empirical issues, but Joe's our, if you don't mind me saying, Joe, our the granddaddy of rural criminology, and one of the things I didn't mention is the need for specific theories of rural criminology, and that's really Joe's. And I see he's got his hand up, so maybe you can speak to that a little bit, Joe.
Yeah, you actually kind of walked toward what I was going to mention as a comment. I probably spent the first 25 years of my career trying to do rural and feeling very isolated within American criminology. And so when the book was produced, the handbook was produced in 2016, my goal was to make it as international as possible. And of course, with the aid of Zoom and electronic technology, scholars are able to connect in very diverse places.